In the spring of 1942, the United States Pacific Fleet existed in a state of profound and precarious imbalance. It was an institution reeling from a cataclysm, a naval force that had witnessed its capital ships, the very symbols of its power, reduced to burning scrap and oily tombs in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. The surviving assets, primarily its 3 aircraft carriers, were numerically and, in some respects, qualitatively inferior to the juggernaut they faced. The Imperial Japanese Navy, and specifically its carrier strike force, the Codebreakers, sailed the Pacific with an aura of invincibility forged in a crucible of victories from the South China Sea to the Indian Ocean. Its naval aviators were a cadre of hardened veterans, men who had honed their deadly craft over China and perfected it in the opening moments of the Pacific War. They flew aircraft like the Mitsubishi A6M0 that had established an almost mythical reputation for untouchable performance, a fighter that could outclimb, outturn, and outrange its American counterparts. The ships they flew from were a testament to Japanese naval design, a homogeneous and powerful force of 6 fleet carriers that could operate as a single, devastating fist. Against this, the Americans could muster a fractured and disparate collection of forces, a navy fighting a holding action across a vast oceanic theater, desperately trading space for time. The inventory of American naval power in the Pacific painted a grim picture of this disparity. Admiral Chester Nimitz, from his headquarters at Pearl Harbor, commanded a fleet that was a shadow of its pre-war projection. The carrier force, the new spine of the fleet, consisted of the USS Lexington, Yorktown, Enterprise, and Hornet. The Lexington and Yorktown were pre-war designs, vessels that had been conceived in one era of naval thought and were now being forced to fight in another. The Enterprise and Hornet were newer, more capable ships, but they were still outnumbered. Their air groups were equipped with aircraft that were, on the whole, inferior to their Japanese equivalents. The Grumman F-4F Wildcat was a rugged and well-armored fighter, but it was slower and far less agile than the Zero. Its pilots survived not through technical superiority, but through courage, teamwork, and the development of new tactics like the Thatch Weave. The Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bomber was a relic, a slow, underpowered, and tragically vulnerable aircraft that had been considered obsolete even before the war began. Only the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bomber could be considered the best in its class, a sturdy, reliable, and exceptionally accurate weapon that would prove to be the fleet's most effective tool. This collection of assets, spread thin by the demands of protecting communication lines to Australia and reinforcing beleaguered outposts, was all that stood between the Codebreakers and its complete dominance of the Pacific Ocean. In contrast, the Japanese naval machine appeared to be a model of lethal efficiency. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander-in-chief of the combined fleet, presided over a force that had not yet known defeat. The 6 carriers of the First Air Fleet, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku, were the core of his power. They were crewed by impeccably trained sailors and carried air groups staffed with pilots who possessed, on average, over 700 hours of flight time, a stark contrast to their American counterparts, many of whom were novices with barely 300. The Japanese possessed a balanced and effective suite of carrier aircraft: the Peerless Zero fighter, the Nakajima B-5N Kate torpedo bomber, which was far superior to the Devastator, and the Aichi D-3 Val dive bomber, a highly accurate, if more vulnerable, aircraft. Japanese naval doctrine emphasized the concentrated power of the carrier strike force, a concept they had pioneered and perfected. Their victory at Pearl Harbor, followed by a string of successes across Southeast Asia, had created a strategic momentum that seemed impossible to halt. They had sunk more Allied capital ships in the first 6 months of the war than the United States Navy had built in the preceding decade. Yet, beneath this veneer of invincibility, new factors were beginning to stir, foreshadowing a potential shift in the grim calculus of the Pacific War. In the basement of the 14th Naval District Administration building at Pearl Harbor, a small, unheralded team of cryptanalysts was engaged in a secret war of their own. Known as Station HYPO, or Fleet Radio Unit Pacific, this organization was tasked with breaking the primary operational code of the Imperial Japanese Navy, a complex system designated JN-25. Led by the unconventional and brilliant Commander Joseph Rockefort, this team of linguists, mathematicians, and analysts worked in Spartan subterranean conditions, surrounded by IBM tabulating machines and mountains of intercepted radio traffic. They were beginning to read fragments of the enemy's mail, small snippets of intelligence that, when pieced together with painstaking effort, could offer a glimpse into the enemy's intentions. Simultaneously, American industry was beginning to stir from its peacetime slumber. The sleeping giant that Yamamoto had feared awakening was slowly, ponderously, beginning to mobilize its immense manufacturing potential. New ships, new aircraft, and new technologies were on the drawing board and the production line. The Essex-class carriers and the Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighter were still months and years away from operational service, but their eventual arrival was a promise of future strength, a promise that the United States could eventually overwhelm Japan through sheer industrial might. In the spring of 1942, however, this was a distant prospect. The immediate future would have to be secured by the men and machines at hand, and by the shadowy work being done in Rockefeller's basement. The catalyst that would accelerate this simmering conflict into a decisive confrontation came not from a naval engagement, but from a daring, almost symbolic, act of retaliation. On April 18, 1942, 16 United States Army Air Force's B-25 Mitchell bombers, launched from the deck of the USS Hornet, appeared in the skies over Tokyo and other Japanese cities. The Doolittle raid inflicted negligible physical damage, but its psychological impact upon the Japanese high command was immense. It was a profound shock to a leadership that had promised its people that the sacred soil of the home islands would never be touched by enemy bombs. The raid exposed a critical vulnerability in Japan's eastern defensive perimeter and created an overwhelming political and military imperative to eliminate the threat of American carriers for good. For Admiral Yamamoto, the raid was a personal affront and the final justification he needed to push forward his plan for a decisive battle, an ambition that had long been at the core of his strategic thinking. He believed that only by luring the remaining American carriers into a final, climactic engagement and destroying them could Japan secure its newly won empire and force the United States to a negotiated peace. In response to the Doolittle raid and the growing strategic imperative it created, Yamamoto and his staff at the combined fleet headquarters finalized a complex and ambitious operational plan, codenamed Operation MI. The objective was the seizure of Midway Atoll, a tiny 2.5-square-mile speck of sand and coral located 1,300 miles northwest of Oahu. While of limited intrinsic value, Midway's strategic importance was its location. In Japanese hands, it would serve as an unsinkable aircraft carrier, an advanced sentinel post that could detect and intercept any American naval movements towards the Japanese home islands. More importantly, Yamamoto knew that the United States could not afford to lose Midway. Its capture would directly threaten Hawaii, and he calculated correctly that Admiral Nimitz would be forced to commit his entire remaining carrier force to its defense. This was the lure. The Japanese plan was a masterpiece of complexity, involving nearly 200 ships, including 11 battleships, 8 aircraft carriers, and dozens of cruisers and destroyers, organized into multiple separate forces that would converge on Midway from different directions. The main carrier strike force, the codebreaking, now comprising 4 carriers under the command of Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, would deliver the opening blow, neutralizing Midway's air defenses. A separate invasion force would then land troops to seize the atoll. Yamamoto himself, aboard his flagship Yamato, would command a massive main body of battleships, sailing several hundred miles behind Nagumo, ready to engage and annihilate the American fleet once it was drawn into the trap. The finalization of Operation MI set in motion a vast bureaucratic and logistical mobilization within the Imperial Japanese Navy. Thousands of orders were drafted, fuel and ammunition were allocated, and ships across the empire began to assemble into their designated task forces. The sheer scale and complexity of the plan were its greatest strengths, but also its greatest weaknesses. It relied on precise timing, perfect coordination between widely dispersed forces, and, most critically, the element of surprise. The Japanese high command was supremely confident, operating under the assumption that the Americans were demoralized, off balance, and ignorant of Japanese intentions. They believed the USS Yorktown had been sunk at the Battle of the Coral Sea, and they estimated that at best, the Americans could only sortie 2 carriers to meet their armada. This supreme confidence led to a critical error. They continued to use the JN-25B naval code, believing it to be secure, to transmit the vast volume of radio traffic required to coordinate the operation. Every one of these transmissions, from high-level strategic directives to mundane logistical requests, was a potential clue, a piece of a puzzle that was being intercepted by American listening posts scattered across the Pacific from Hawaii to Australia. The fate of the entire operation was now being typed onto encrypted punch cards in a basement in Pearl Harbor. The burden of unraveling Yamamoto's grand design fell squarely upon the shoulders of Commander Rockefort and his team at Station HYPO. By May of 1942, they had made significant progress in penetrating the JN-25B code. They could not read the Japanese messages in their entirety like a newspaper, but through a combination of brilliant analytical work, captured codebooks from a salvaged submarine, and sheer intellectual persistence, they could decrypt approximately 10 to 15% of any given message. More importantly, they could often decipher the crucial who, what, and where of an operation. Throughout early May, HYPO detected a massive surge in Japanese naval radio traffic, all using the JN-25B system. This traffic indicated the assembly of a major naval force and pointed towards a large-scale offensive operation scheduled for late May or early June. The codebreakers began to pick up key designators for the forces involved: the WWII, the 2nd Fleet, and numerous other units. The missing piece of the puzzle, the target of this immense armada, was maddeningly elusive. The decrypted messages referred to the objective with the geographic designator AF. The intelligence staff in Washington, known as OP-20G, believed that AF could refer to a location in the South Pacific, possibly near the Aleutian Islands or even the west coast of the United States. However, Rockefort and his team at Pearl Harbor, having steeped themselves in the patterns and rhythms of Japanese naval communications, felt a growing certainty that AF was Midway. Their analysis was supported by Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, Nimitz's fleet intelligence officer, who had developed a deep respect for HYPO's work and a keen intuition for Japanese strategic thinking. But certainty and intuition were not enough. Admiral Nimitz needed proof before he could risk his last 3 carriers in a battle against a numerically superior foe. He was being pulled in 2 directions by his intelligence advisors in Washington and his own team in Hawaii. A wrong decision would not only be disastrous, it would be fatal to the entire American war effort in the Pacific. The pressure to identify AF definitively became the single most critical intelligence challenge of the war. It was at this critical juncture that one of Rockefort's staff, Commander Jasper Holmes, devised a simple but ingenious deception. If AF was indeed Midway, then the island's garrison would have a source of fresh water. Holmes proposed that the base at Midway be instructed to send a secure, underwater cable message back to Pearl Harbor reporting that its water distillation plant had broken down and that they were critically short of fresh water. They were then to follow this up with a plain-language radio transmission, which they knew the Japanese would intercept, broadcasting the same false information. Nimitz approved the plan. On May 22nd, Midway duly sent out its unencrypted message about the water shortage. Within 48 hours, American listening posts intercepted a Japanese intelligence message, sent in the JN-25B code, reporting that AF is short on water. The trap had been sprung. Rockefort's team now had the irrefutable proof they needed. They could now report to Nimitz with absolute confidence. The target of the largest naval operation in Japanese history was the tiny American outpost at Midway Atoll. This single piece of intelligence transformed the entire strategic picture. The element of surprise, the cornerstone of Yamamoto's plan, had been lost. The hunter was about to become the hunted. The confirmation of Midway as the target triggered a frantic race against time. While the Japanese fleet was still assembling and beginning its long journey across the Pacific, Admiral Nimitz and his staff worked to scrape together every available asset to meet the threat. This process of adaptation was most dramatically embodied in the fate of the USS Yorktown. The carrier had been severely damaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea, suffering a direct bomb hit that had buckled her flight deck and started massive fires. Upon her limping return to Pearl Harbor on May 27th, damage assessment teams initially estimated that repairs would take at least 3 months. Such a delay was unacceptable. Nimitz personally inspected the ship and, after consulting with shipyard engineers, made a bold demand: The ship was to be made battle-ready in 3 days. What followed was a miracle of industrial improvisation and human effort. Over 1,400 shipyard workers swarmed the Yorktown, working around the clock in the stifling heat of the dry dock. Damaged frames were not replaced but merely reinforced. Ruptured plates were patched rather than fully repaired. Entire sections of the electrical system were jury-rigged. The workers, driven by an acute sense of urgency, accomplished the impossible. 72 hours after entering dry dock, the USS Yorktown, with repair crews still on board finishing their work, steamed out of Pearl Harbor to rejoin the fleet. Her presence at the coming battle would provide Nimitz with a third carrier air group, a critical addition that would help to even the odds against Nagumo's 4 carriers. This incredible feat of repair was a microcosm of the larger American industrial effort, a demonstration of the nation's ability to overcome material deficits through sheer will and ingenuity. The process of adaptation was not limited to ship repair. It extended to a complete reevaluation of naval air doctrine, forced by the harsh realities of combat and technological limitations. The dismal performance of the TBD Devastator torpedo bomber was a particularly thorny problem. It was recognized as a death trap, yet it was the only carrier-based torpedo aircraft available. In the absence of better equipment, tactics had to change. Training exercises focused on coordinated attacks, with fighters providing suppression of enemy combat air patrol and dive bombers striking simultaneously with the torpedo planes to divide the attention of anti-aircraft gunners. Furthermore, the roles of aircraft were being reimagined out of necessity. At Midway itself, the Marine Air Group was a motley collection of outdated Brewster F-2A Buffalo fighters and Vought SB-2U Vindicator dive bombers, aircraft that stood no chance in a direct confrontation with their Japanese counterparts. Even the Army Air Force's B-17 flying fortresses stationed on the island, while powerful bombers, were designed for high-altitude strategic bombing and proved to be remarkably inaccurate against maneuvering maritime targets. The entire American plan was a patchwork of desperate improvisations, a gamble that relied on placing inferior forces in the right place at the right time, armed with just enough intelligence to give them a fighting chance. The operational plan devised by Nimitz was the mirror image of Yamamoto's. Where the Japanese plan was complex and dispersed, the American plan was simple and concentrated. Task Force 16, under the command of Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance, a cruiser commander who had replaced the ailing Admiral William Halsey, was built around the carriers Enterprise and Hornet. Task Force 17, commanded by Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who would have overall tactical command, consisted of the hastily repaired Yorktown. These 2 task forces were ordered to a position northeast of Midway, a location codenamed Point Luck. From here, they would lie in ambush, waiting for the Japanese fleet to be detected by the long-range PBY Catalina patrol planes stationed on the atoll. The American plan was entirely dependent on intelligence. They knew the enemy's objective, his approximate strength, and his expected direction of approach. Nimitz's orders to Fletcher and Spruance were a model of clarity and trust, concluding with the famous directive to be governed by the principle of calculated risk. He was entrusting the fate of the Pacific War to the judgment of his commanders at sea, armed with the priceless advantage provided by Rockefeller's Codebreakers. While the fleets converged on their oceanic rendezvous, the human element of this unfolding drama was most intensely felt by the air crews who would have to execute these grand strategic plans. For the pilots of the PBY Catalina patrol squadrons based at Midway, the days leading up to the battle were a grueling ordeal of long, monotonous flights over an empty ocean. These lumbering, unpressurized flying boats would take off in the pre-dawn darkness and fly sector searches out to a range of 700 miles, spending over 12 hours in the air. The crews, exhausted and tense, scanned the endless expanse of blue water, knowing that they were the tripwire for the entire American defense. Their vulnerability was palpable. A slow, clumsy aircraft, they would be easy prey for any Zeros they encountered. On the morning of June 3rd, the tension was finally broken. Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a PBY from Squadron VP-44, droned through the cloud-dappled sky some 700 miles west of Midway. Suddenly, through a break in the clouds, he saw them, the telltale wakes of ships. His excited, uncoded radio message crackled back to Midway. Sighted main body, though he had actually spotted the Japanese invasion force. Not Nagumo's carriers, The first piece of the Japanese puzzle had been placed on the board. The battle had begun. The initial American response was disjointed and ineffective, a perfect illustration of the inexperience and equipment limitations plaguing the U.S. forces. Following the sighting of the Japanese transport force, a flight of 9 B-17s took off from Midway to intercept. They found the ships and conducted a high-altitude bombing run from 12,000 feet, dropping a total of 36 600-pound bombs. From that altitude, bombing a maneuvering ship was akin to dropping a needle into a haystack from a second-story window. The bombers' crews reported hitting several ships and starting fires, claims born of optimism and the confusion of combat. In reality, not a single bomb hit its mark. Later that night, for PBYs, specially equipped with torpedoes in a desperate field modification, attempted a night attack. In a remarkable feat of airmanship, they located the transport force in the darkness. Only one pilot, Ensign Gaylord Probst, managed to press his attack home, releasing his torpedo. It struck the fleet oiler Akabano Maru, causing minor damage but no serious impediment to the Japanese advance. These opening skirmishes, while failing to inflict significant harm, confirmed the presence of a large Japanese force and heightened the sense of impending crisis on Midway and aboard the American carriers. The view from the cockpit for the pilots stationed on Midway itself was one of facing overwhelming odds with patently inadequate tools. The Marine Air Group 22, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Ira Kimes, was a mix of bravado and deep-seated anxiety. Their primary fighter was the Brewster F-2A3 Buffalo, an aircraft so notoriously deficient that its pilots grimly joked it was a flying coffin. It was slow, had a poor rate of climb, and was no match for the Japanese Zero. Their dive bombers were the equally aged Vought SB-2U Vindicator. Nicknamed the Wind Indicator, the young Marine and Navy pilots who flew these machines knew they were being sent into battle against the same veteran aviators who had devastated Pearl Harbor. Their courage was not born of confidence in their equipment, but of a fierce, fatalistic sense of duty. As the dawn broke on June 4th, they scrambled to intercept the incoming Japanese airstrike, a wave of over 100 enemy aircraft. They flew with the grim knowledge that their chances of survival, let alone success, were vanishingly small. Their sacrifice was intended to buy time, to blunt the Japanese assault just enough to allow the American carriers, still hidden over the horizon, to deliver the decisive blow. At 4:30 on the morning of June 4th, aboard his flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo made the fateful decision that would set the day's tragic events in motion. Based on his intelligence, which reported no American carriers in the vicinity, he ordered the launch of his first strike wave against Midway Atoll. 108 aircraft, 36 Kate torpedo bombers, 36 Val dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters, rose from the decks of the four carriers and formed up into a massive, disciplined formation. Their mission was to obliterate the air power on Midway and soften the island's defenses for the impending invasion. As these planes winged their way southeast, Nagumo made another critical decision. He held his second wave of aircraft in reserve, arming them with torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs for anti-ship strikes, just in case any American vessels were discovered. However, this was considered a remote contingency. The primary focus was Midway. This decision meant that the flight decks of his carriers were now a scene of intense activity, with ordnance carts and ground crews moving to arm the remaining 93 aircraft. The build-up to the main engagement was a chaotic sequence of sightings, partial reports, and desperate, piecemeal attacks from Midway. At 5:30, a PBY Catalina spotted the Japanese carrier force and radioed its position. Minutes later, another PBY sighted the inbound Japanese airstrike. On Midway, the air raid sirens shrieked. Every flyable aircraft was ordered into the air. The B-17s lumbered off to attack the carriers, while the Marine fighters climbed to intercept the Japanese bombers. The island's bombers, 6 TBF Avenger torpedo bombers, a brand new type seeing its first combat, and 4 Army B-26 Marauders also armed with torpedoes, were sent out to strike the Kido Butai. This sequence of attacks was a testament to the courage of the American airmen, but it was a tactical disaster. The attacks were uncoordinated. The Marine fighters were swatted from the sky by the superior Zeros. Of the 25 that rose to fight, 15 were shot down and 7 more were heavily damaged. The torpedo attacks were suicidal. The slow TBFs and the faster but still vulnerable B-20 SIXS pressed home their attacks without fighter cover. Anti-aircraft fire and swarming Zeros tore them apart. Not a single torpedo found its mark. The sacrifice was immense, with 5 of the 6 TBFs and 2 of the 4 B-20 SIXS being lost. The reports filtering back to Nagumo from his strike leader over Midway, Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga, introduced the first element of confusion into the Japanese command calculus. Tominaga radioed the now infamous message: "There is need for a second attack. The initial strike had not been sufficient to neutralize Midway's air power." At the same time, the piecemeal but persistent attacks from the island's bombers, though unsuccessful, demonstrated that Midway remained a threat. Nagumo was now faced with a critical dilemma. His reserve aircraft were armed for a naval battle that had not materialized. His carriers were still being scouted by American patrol planes, and his first strike wave would soon be returning, low on fuel and needing to land. At 7:15, he made a decision that would seal his fate. He ordered the reserve aircraft, which were armed with torpedoes, to be taken below decks and rearmed with land attack bombs for a second strike on Midway. This was a complex and time-consuming process. It meant that for the next hour, his flight decks would be cluttered with ordnance, fuel lines, and aircraft, rendering them incapable of launching a new strike. He was trading a potential immediate response for a more thorough, but delayed second strike on the island. The fog of war, that impenetrable combination of incomplete information, conflicting reports, and the sheer friction of combat, now descended fully upon Nagumo's flagship. At 7:28, just as the rearming process was getting underway, a frantic report arrived from one of his scout planes. The message was delayed and garbled, but its content was electrifying. Cited what appears TOB-10 enemy surface ships. A subsequent, clearer message arrived at 8:20 confirming the presence of an American carrier. Nagumo's world was instantly turned upside down. The remote contingency had become a sudden, terrifying reality. He was now caught in the worst possible situation for a carrier commander. His first strike was returning and needed to land. His flight decks were in chaos with bombs and torpedoes being moved, and an enemy carrier force was somewhere over the horizon, preparing to strike. He immediately issued a countermanding order: cease rearming for the Midway strike. Rearm with torpedoes. This reversal compounded the chaos. Ordnance crews who had just finished moving 800-kilogram land bombs now had to move them again and replace them with torpedoes. The flight decks of the Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu became a nightmare of frantic, dangerous work, a lethal jumble of high explosives, aviation fuel, and exhausted men working under immense pressure. Meanwhile, aboard the American carriers, the morning had been a tense wait. Fletcher and Spruance had received the reports from the Midway-based PBYs. At 7:02, Spruance, in a moment of decisive and aggressive judgment, ordered his carriers, Enterprise and Hornet, to turn into the wind and begin launching their full strike groups. He did not wait for a perfect sighting report. He knew the enemy was there, and he gambled on launching at extreme range to catch the Japanese carriers while they were vulnerable, recovering their Midway strike. It was a decision of immense consequence. The American air groups, a total of 116 aircraft from Enterprise and Hornet, took to the air between 7 o'clock and 8 o'clock. Yorktown launched its smaller strike group an hour later. The plan was for a coordinated attack. The slow Devastator torpedo bombers of Torpedo Squadrons 8, 6, and 3 would go in low, forcing the Japanese carriers to maneuver and drawing down the enemy fighter patrols. The dauntless dive bombers of Bombing Squadrons 6 and 3 and Scouting Squadron 6 would then arrive high overhead and dive down through the thinned fighter screen to deliver the killing blows. But the plan immediately fell apart in the vastness of the Pacific sky. The first to find the enemy were the torpedo bombers, and their story is one of the most tragic and heroic episodes in American military history. The 15 TBD Devastators of Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John C. Waldron, became separated from their fighter escort. Waldron, flying on sheer instinct and a conviction that the Japanese had changed course, broke from the planned flight path and led his squadron directly towards the enemy. He found them, At approximately 9:20, his squadron commenced its attack on the Codebreakers. What followed was not a battle, but a slaughter. The slow, lumbering devastators were pounced upon by a swarm of Zero fighters. One by one, they were shot out of the sky, trailing fire and smoke. They pressed their attack with a courage that bordered on the suicidal, flying straight and level into a hurricane of anti-aircraft fire and cannon shells. Not a single one of their torpedoes hit a target. Of the 15 aircraft and 30 men that began the attack, only one man, Ensign George Gay, survived. He floated in the water, wounded, clinging to a seat cushion, and became a solitary witness to the subsequent destruction of the fleet that had just killed all of his comrades. Shortly after the annihilation of Torpedo Squadron 8, the 14 devastators of Torpedo Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, led by Lieutenant Commander Eugene E. Lindsay, arrived and began their attack. They too were met by the full fury of the Japanese combat air patrol and defensive fire. They bored in, suffering horrendous losses. 10 of the 14 planes were shot down. Again, they failed to score a single hit. Finally, the 12 planes of Torpedo Squadron 3 from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey, made their run. They met the same fate. 10 more aircraft were destroyed for no result. In the space of less than an hour, 35 of the 41 American torpedo bombers that had attacked the Codebreakers had been destroyed. The sacrifice was almost total, but it was not in vain. In their suicidal courage, the men of the torpedo squadrons had accomplished 3 critical things. They had confirmed the exact location of the Japanese carriers for everyone else. They had pulled the Japanese Zero fighters down to sea level, leaving the skies at high altitude unprotected. And they had forced the Japanese carriers into violent evasive maneuvers, preventing them from spotting and launching their own counterstrike. Their sacrifice had set the stage for a miracle. High above, at 20,000 feet, 2 squadrons of SBD Dauntless dive bombers were nearing the point of fuel exhaustion. The 33 bombers of Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6 from the Enterprise, led by the Air Group Commander, Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, had missed the Japanese fleet at its anticipated location. McCluskey, an aggressive and determined leader, made a command decision that would alter the course of the war. Instead of turning back, he decided to continue his search to the northwest, gambling his squadron's fuel reserve on a hunch. At 10:20, after seeing the wake of a lone Japanese destroyer, the Ayrshire, which was racing to catch up with the main fleet after depth-charging an American submarine, he altered course to follow it. Minutes later, he saw them. Spread out below him, turning back into the wind to launch their aircraft, were the carriers of the Codebreakers. By a staggering coincidence of timing, at the exact same moment, the 17 Dauntless from the Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell F. Leslie, also arrived over the target from a different direction. The Japanese carriers were at their most vulnerable. Their combat air patrol was at sea level dealing with the last of the torpedo bombers, and their flight decks were packed with fully fueled and armed aircraft, readying for the counterstrike against the American fleet. The 5 minutes that followed, between 10:20 and 10:25 a.m. on June 4, 1942, were arguably the most decisive of the entire Pacific War. McCluskey and Leslie pushed their squadrons over into near-vertical dives. The American pilots descended through a sky that was almost empty of enemy fighters. The Japanese sailors below looked up in horror as the distinctive shape of the Dauntless appeared directly overhead. The first bombs struck the carrier Kaga. 1,000-pound bombs slammed into her flight deck. They pierced the deck and exploded among the fueled and armed aircraft below, setting off a chain reaction of catastrophic secondary explosions. Kaga was transformed into a raging inferno within seconds. Almost simultaneously, McCluskey's own group targeted the flagship Akagi. The first bomb was a near miss, but the next slammed into the midship elevator and detonated in the hangar deck, which was packed with torpedo-armed Kate bombers. A second bomb hit the aft of the flight deck. The flagship of the Codebreakers was instantly engulfed in flames and smoke. At the same time, Leslie's squadron from the Yorktown dove on the carrier Soryu. 3 direct hits turned the ship into a blazing wreck. In less than 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 carriers of the Japanese strike force had been mortally wounded, their backs broken by the precise, deadly attacks of the Dauntless. The tide of battle had not just turned. It had been reversed in a sudden, violent cataclysm. Only one Japanese carrier, the Hiryu, commanded by Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, escaped the initial onslaught. Hidden by a rain squall to the north, Hiryu now represented the entirety of Japan's carrier striking power. Yamaguchi, one of the most aggressive and respected admirals in the Japanese Navy, acted with swift and vengeful determination. At 11 o'clock, he launched his first strike wave of 18 Val dive bombers escorted by 6 Zeros. They followed the retreating American aircraft back towards their source. Just before noon, they found the USS Yorktown. The Yorktown's combat air patrol of Wildcat fighters intercepted the Japanese planes, shooting down most of the bombers, but a handful broke through. They dove on the carrier, scoring 3 direct hits. The bombs ruptured the uptakes from the boilers, stopping the ship dead in the water and starting serious fires. The Yorktown was grievously wounded, listing heavily to port. Her damage control teams, seasoned by their recent experience at the Coral Sea and the frantic repairs in Pearl Harbor, went to work with incredible efficiency. Within 2 hours, they had contained the fires, patched the flight deck, and, miraculously, restored power to the engines. The Yorktown was once again underway, making 20 knots. Admiral Yamaguchi, believing he had sunk one American carrier, launched his second and last strike wave at 13:30. This wave consisted of 10 torpedo-armed Kate bombers and 6 Zero escorts. They too found the Yorktown. The ship's crew, seeing the torpedo planes boring in, thought they were American aircraft returning. The confusion was brief but fatal. Despite a hail of anti-aircraft fire, the Japanese pilots pressed their attacks with skill and courage. 2 torpedoes slammed into the Yorktown's port side, rupturing her fuel tanks and causing a massive loss of power. The ship took on a severe list, and with the risk of her capsizing, Captain Elliot Buckmaster gave the order to abandon ship at 14:55. The heroic carrier, which had twice been brought back from the brink of destruction, was finally doomed. But her sacrifice had not been in vain. She had absorbed the entirety of the Japanese counterattack, leaving the Enterprise and Hornet untouched and free to deliver the final blow. Admiral Spruance, now in tactical command, knew the 4th Japanese carrier was still at large. Scout planes from the Yorktown had located the Hiryu before the carrier was abandoned. Spruance marshaled a strike force of 24 dive bombers from the Enterprise, including several homeless planes from the Yorktown. They launched at 15:30. At 1700 hours, they found the Hiryu, which was preparing to launch a third strike. The American SBDs dove down on the last of Nagumo's carriers. They planted 4 bombs into her flight deck. Like her sisters, Hiryu was quickly consumed by uncontrollable fires, her forward elevator collapsing into a twisted ruin. With the destruction of the Hiryu, the Battle of the Carriers was over. The pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy, the invincible Codebreakers, had ceased to exist. Yamamoto, far to the rear aboard the Yamato, received the unbelievable news with stunned disbelief. His intricate plan had collapsed into an unprecedented disaster. In the early hours of June 5th, he finally ordered a general retirement of all his forces. Operation MI was a catastrophic failure. The immediate aftermath of the carrier battle was a scene of both grim finality and desperate survival. The night of June 4th was illuminated by the ghastly light of the burning Japanese carriers. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, all beyond saving, were scuttled by Japanese destroyers to prevent their capture. Hiryu, burning fiercely, would sink the next morning. Aboard the American ships, there was a sense of exhausted, almost incredulous elation. Pilots returned to their ready rooms, their faces streaked with oil and cordite, to report their incredible success. The human cost had been severe. The United States had lost the carrier Yorktown, the destroyer USS Hammond, sunk by a Japanese submarine while assisting the crippled Yorktown, and approximately 150 aircraft. But the price paid by the Japanese was ruinous. They had lost 4 of their best fleet carriers, the heavy cruiser Mikuma, and over 250 aircraft. Most devastatingly, they had lost over 3,000 men, including hundreds of their most experienced and irreplaceable veteran pilots. This was a loss from which Japanese naval aviation would never fully recover. A tactical evaluation of the battle reveals a complex interplay of factors that led to the American victory. The superiority of American intelligence was the foundational element, transforming a potential ambush into a counter-ambush. The courage and sacrifice of the torpedo bomber crews, while tactically futile, were strategically decisive in disrupting the Japanese defenses and creating the opening for the dive bombers. The ruggedness of American aircraft and the superior damage control of their ships, exemplified by the repeated survival of the Yorktown, played a crucial role. Conversely, the Japanese defeat can be attributed to several key failures. Their operational plan was too complex and rigid. Their intelligence was abysmal, failing to detect the American carriers until it was too late. Nagumo's command decisions, particularly the decision to rearm his reserve strike, created a window of extreme vulnerability. Finally, the Japanese doctrine of concentrating their combat air patrol at low altitude left them fatally exposed to the high-level dive-bombing attack that ultimately destroyed them. In his official after-action report, Admiral Nimitz summarized the victory with characteristic understatement, but the significance was clear. He wrote, "Perhaps we will be forgiven if we claim we are about midway to our objective." He praised the glorious and determining role of the naval aviators, and credited the victory to all branches of the service that had contributed. The reports from the fleet commanders Spruance and Fletcher provided a more granular analysis. They highlighted the critical importance of the SBD Dauntless dive bomber, which had proven to be the single most effective weapon of the battle. They also noted the urgent need for a replacement for the TBD Devastator and for a fighter that could contend on more even terms with the Japanese Zero. The battle became a crucible for American naval doctrine, reinforcing the primacy of the aircraft carrier and providing a host of hard-won lessons that would shape the conduct of the war for the next 3 years. In the grand summary of the Pacific War, the Battle of Midway stands as the pivotal turning point. Before Midway, the United States Navy was on the strategic defensive, reacting to Japanese moves and fighting desperately to survive. The trajectory of the war was one of continuous Japanese expansion. After Midway, the strategic initiative passed to the United States. The catastrophic loss of 4 of their frontline carriers permanently blunted Japan's offensive capability and even the naval balance in the Pacific. It created the window of opportunity for the United States to launch its own first major offensive at Guadalcanal just 2 months later. The transformation was absolute. The force that had been shattered at Pearl Harbor had, in just 6 months, risen to inflict a defeat on the Imperial Japanese Navy that was more decisive and strategically significant than the one it had suffered. Reevaluating the forces in the aftermath, the United States Navy was no longer the weaker power. While still facing a long and arduous conflict, it now possessed a qualitative and, crucially, a psychological edge. The myth of Japanese invincibility had been shattered. The American naval aviator, though still often flying inferior equipment, had proven he could defeat his vaunted opponent through skill, courage, and superior tactics. More importantly, the industrial disparity between the two nations now became the dominant factor. While Japan struggled to replace its catastrophic losses in ships and veteran pilots, the shipyards and factories of the United States were beginning to produce new Essex-class carriers, Hellcat fighters, and Avenger torpedo bombers in overwhelming numbers. The victory at Midway did not win the war, but it created the conditions under which the war could not be lost. The final, concluding thesis of the Battle of Midway is a testament to the profound impact of intelligence in modern warfare. It demonstrates that superior information, when placed in the hands of commanders willing to take calculated risks, can overcome material and numerical inferiority. The victory was a product of many parts. The industrial might that repaired the Yorktown, the courage of the pilots who flew into a wall of fire, the inspired leadership of Spruance, and a significant measure of luck. But at its core, the triumph was born in the quiet, windowless basement of Station HYPO. It was the intellectual victory of Joseph Rockefort and his codebreakers, who had read the enemy's mind, that made the physical victory possible. Midway was the ultimate proof that in the complex, technologically driven warfare of the 20th century, the decisive weapon is not always a torpedo or a bomb, but a single critical piece of information.